We are taught from a very young age that growth is a straight line pointing up. More clients, more revenue, more status. We treat scale like a religion, and busyness like a badge of honor. We look at crowded calendars and late-night emails as proof that we are winning the game of life. But we rarely stop to ask a terrifying question: what happens when the very thing you built begins to consume you? What is the actual value of $1 million empire if you have to trade your soul, your sanity, and your evenings just to keep the lights on? In the winter of 2022, an agency CEO named Julian did something that his peers and competitors called professional suicide. He didn't just pivot his business model, and he didn't just downsize his staff. Julian systematically fired every single one of his corporate clients. He closed his sleek downtown office, packed 2 suitcases with his most essential belongings, and moved entirely alone to a secluded cabin in the woods, wrapped in morning mist and silence. Everyone in his network thought he was having a nervous breakdown. They assumed he was burning his career to the ground and walking away from wealth. But what they didn't realize was that Julian was actually about to unlock it. Within 18 months of living in total isolation, operating entirely on his own strict terms, he was generating twice as much net profit as he did in the city, while working less than 15 hours a week from a wooden kitchen table. This is not a story about quitting or escaping reality. It's a story about the terrifying power of boundaries, and how walking away from toxic capital is sometimes the only way to unlock a life of quiet luxury and high-leverage independence. To understand why Julian left, you have to understand exactly what he had built. By his late 20s, Julian had achieved the textbook definition of modern entrepreneurial success. He owned a thriving creative marketing agency, managed 24 active corporate accounts, employed a dedicated team of 8 people, and operated out of a beautiful, glass-walled office space. On paper, he was a king. On the weekends, he could easily afford the finest restaurants, luxury clothes, and high-end tech. But beneath the polished surface, his life did not belong to him. Julian had fallen face-first into the classic trap of the modern marketplace, the illusion of scale. He genuinely believed that more revenue equaled more personal freedom. In reality, his clients didn't just buy his agency's creative services, they bought his peace of mind. He found himself utterly trapped in a cycle of toxic capital. These were high-paying corporations that believed because they wrote large checks, they owned Julian's weekends, his family time, and his self-respect. They demanded endless, arbitrary revisions, threw manufactured late-night emergencies over the wall, and treated his design team with a subtle, crushing condescension. Julian was living inside a golden cage. He was managing a highly visible, celebrated business, yet he felt entirely powerless. The absolute breaking point arrived on a rainy Tuesday evening at 9 p.m. He was sitting alone at his desk, a cold container of takeout food sitting untouched next to his laptop, listening to a middle manager client scream at him over the phone about a minor font choice on a landing page. Julian looked at his exhausted reflection in the dark office window and realized a brutal, undeniable truth: he wasn't a true CEO. He was just a highly paid servant to 24 different masters, and the cost of his business was his life. The very next morning, Julian called an emergency meeting, not with his clients, and not with his team, but with his own financial spreadsheets. He sat down and calculated the raw numbers with absolute honesty. What he discovered was a profound revelation that changed his entire worldview: 80% of his personal stress, organizational chaos, and massive financial overhead came from 90% of his clients. These were the loudest, most demanding, and most toxic accounts, who ironically contributed the absolute least to his actual net profit after accounting for the endless hours required to soothe their egos. He decided to run an experiment in radical subtraction. Over the course of 30 days, Julian systematically sent out polite, elegant, and completely unyielding emails to every single client on his roster. He thanked them for their partnership, informed them that the agency was shifting its operational direction, and officially terminated their contracts. He spent his remaining capital helping his employees transition into excellent new roles elsewhere, paid out generous severances, and broke his commercial office lease. He stripped his life down to the absolute bone. When he finally arrived at the small, minimalist cabin 3 hours north of the corporate noise, the silence was deafening. There were no Slack notifications, no urgent phone calls, and no artificial deadlines. For the first 2 weeks, Julian actually felt an overwhelming wave of guilt and anxiety. The modern world has deeply conditioned us to believe that if we are not actively producing, busy, or stressed, we are somehow failing. But as the days slowed down to a human pace, the mental fog began to lift. In the quiet of the cabin, stripped of the constant pressure to perform for toxic capital, Julian began to see his professional craft through a completely clear lens. He realized that when you are constantly running around putting out fires, you never have the coordinates or the time to look at the spark. From his wooden table surrounded by pines, Julian rebuilt his professional life entirely from first principles. He no longer wanted a sprawling agency, he wanted high-leverage independence. He decided he would only work with clients who met 3 non-negotiable criteria. First, they had to respect his absolute boundaries, meaning no phone calls, no unscheduled meetings, and communications restricted to a single weekly structured update. Second, they had to possess a massive problem that only Julian's specific, high-level strategic expertise could solve. And third, they had to pay strictly for outcomes, not for hours spent at a desk. Instead of frantically chasing 24 average corporate accounts to feed a massive overhead, Julian focused all his energy on finding just 2 ideal partners. Because his overhead was now practically zero, his personal expenses were incredibly low. He didn't need to accept bad behavior or toxic terms just to cover a baseline payroll. He possessed the ultimate business superpower, the financial and emotional freedom to say an immediate, calm no. And this is where the beautiful paradox of boundaries took effect. Because Julian was isolated in his cabin, far away from the daily corporate panic, the strategic advice he delivered to those 2 clients was flawless. He wasn't distracted by meaningless emails or employee management. He was thinking deeply, analyzing macro trends, and reviewing data with a level of terrifying clarity that no city-bound, burnt-out executive could ever hope to match. He helped those 2 businesses completely revolutionize their operations and double their revenue. In return, he shifted his fee structure to a percentage of the growth he created. Suddenly, Julian was no longer selling his time, he was selling his judgment. And high-level judgment is the highest leveraged, highest-paying asset in the modern economy. Within 12 months, those 2 perfect clients were paying him more than his entire old 24-client roster had ever generated in net profit. Julian's journey isn't actually about a cabin in the woods or escaping into nature. The cabin is merely a beautiful, physical symbol for a mental space where the outside world is no longer allowed to dictate your internal value. True wealth is never about the sheer size of the empire you manage, the number of employees under your watch, or the commas in your bank account. True wealth is the amount of architectural control you possess over your daily existence. It is the priceless luxury of waking up in the morning and asking yourself, what do I want to create today, rather than asking, what do I have to survive today? The philosopher Henry David Thoreau once wrote that the cost of a thing is the amount of what he called life which is required to be exchanged for it. We often tolerate toxic relationships, abusive clients, and soul-crushing stress because we are deeply terrified of what we will lose if we finally let them go. But Julian's experiment proves that subtraction is almost always the fastest path to multiplication. When you have the courage to fire the noise and walk away from toxic capital, you finally grant yourself the quiet space required to hear the things that actually matter. You don't need to buy a piece of land in the wilderness to build your own cabin. You simply need to begin building a rigorous, unyielding wall of boundaries around your time, your mind, and your human dignity. A life of quiet luxury, peace, and high-leverage freedom is never bought with money. It is bought with the quiet, radical courage to walk away from anything that asks you to pay with your peace of mind.